The autumn of 1887 came down hard on the Wyoming territory, driving cold ahead of it like a man with a grudge. Snow dusted the ridgeline above Clearwater Flats before October was even half done, and the sage went silver overnight, brittle as old promises. Silas Cade felt it the moment he stepped off the porch that morning, the wind cutting through his flannel shirt and finding every thin place in the wool. He stood there a moment with his coffee, watching the gray roll in from the north, and thought about the winter to come. The woodpile was short, the larder was shorter. His son, Thomas, was 6 years old and growing the way boys do, fast and hungry, and Silas had lain awake 3 nights running, trying to figure a way through that did not shame either of them. He had come up with nothing good. What he had come up with, finally, was the advertisement he'd read 3 times in the Clearwater Courier before folding it into his breast pocket and carrying it around for a week like a thing he hadn't decided about yet. Respectable widow or capable woman of good character sought, it read, for housekeeping and domestic management of a working ranch. Fair terms negotiated. Inquire Silas Cade, Box 14, Clearwater Flats, Wyoming Ter. He'd written it himself, and it had taken 4 drafts to not sound either desperate or indecent. He thought the final version managed both traps, barely. He had not expected a reply for 3 weeks. He'd received one in 9 days, on good cream-colored stationery, that smelled faintly of something he couldn't name. Not flowers exactly, more like the inside of a library. The handwriting was precise as a schoolteacher's, and the letter was short. She would come on the 12th. She would require her own room. She had experience managing large households and expected the terms to reflect that. She signed it, Esther Vance, and beneath her name she had added, in smaller letters, that she did not cook elaborate meals, but she cooked honest ones. Silas had read that last line twice, and felt something loosen slightly in his chest. The 12th arrived cold and bright, the kind of Wyoming morning that looked like a painting until the wind reminded you it was real life. Silas drove the wagon into Clearwater Flats, with Thomas sitting beside him on the bench, the boy's legs swinging because they didn't quite reach, his hat pulled down over his ears. Thomas had been told only that a woman was coming to help around the house. He'd asked if she would be nice. Silas had said he didn't know yet. Thomas had accepted that with the grave practicality of a child who had learned not to expect too many certainties from life. The train was 12 minutes late, which gave Silas time to stand on the platform in the wind and second-guess everything he'd set in motion. He had almost talked himself into turning the wagon around when the locomotive came grinding in, and then there was no more time for doubt. The passengers came down the steps in the usual straggling order, and Silas was scanning for a woman who looked capable. He'd half expected someone thick-armed and red-faced, a farm wife type, when he saw her and stopped scanning. She was tall. That was the first thing. Tall and straight, dressed in dark traveling clothes that had once been fine and still held their shape, carrying a single leather trunk by its handle, as if she didn't need help and wouldn't ask for it. Her face was composed in the particular way of someone who has decided not to show anything in public. Her hair was dark, pinned severely under a small hat. She was not what he'd pictured. She looked like someone who belonged in a city, not on a Wyoming platform in October cold. She also looked, he noticed, like she hadn't slept much on the train. He stepped forward. He said his name. She turned and looked at him with eyes the color of creek water in winter, gray-green and direct, and she said, "Mr. Cade, and this is your boy?" She looked down at Thomas without smiling, and before Silas could make an introduction, Thomas looked straight up at her and said, "Are you going to stay?" Esther Vance looked at the boy for a moment. Then she looked at Silas. "That," she said, "depends entirely on the terms." Silas reached for her trunk. She let him take it, which he counted as a reasonable beginning. They didn't talk much on the ride out. Thomas sat between them on the bench and chattered some about the ranch dog and the color of the barn, and a hawk he'd seen last Tuesday. Esther answered each thing he said with a brief, honest response, and did not talk down to him, which Silas noted. When the wagon came over the last rise and the ranch came into view, modest, working, not pretty, Esther looked at it for a moment without comment. Then she said, "Where is my room?" He showed her. It was small, but it had a window that faced east, and he'd put clean linen on the bed that morning, pressing the sheets himself with a flat iron he barely knew how to use. She set her trunk down and turned to face him in the doorway. "Now," she said, "the terms." The terms took the better part of an hour to settle. They sat across the kitchen table with cups of coffee going cold between them because neither of them thought to drink, and Silas laid out what he could offer: the room, meals, a small monthly wage he was honest about being able to barely manage, and Esther listened without interrupting. She had a way of listening that made a man feel his words were being weighed on a scale, precisely, and he found himself saying things more carefully than he usually did. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will manage the house and the cooking. I will see to the child's education, such as can be done here, 5 days a week. I will not do field labor." He said that was fair. She said, "I will require Sundays for myself, entirely." He said that was also fair. She folded her hands on the table and said, "One more thing. I am not here to become part of this family. I am here to fulfill an agreement. When circumstances change on either side, we part without grievance. Understood?" Silas looked at her. He said, "Understood." They shook on it across the table, her grip firm and brief. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway at that exact moment, still wearing his hat, and looked at their joined hands with the uncomplicated curiosity of 6 years old. "Did you make a deal?" he asked. Silas said yes. Thomas considered this carefully and then said, "Papa makes good deals. He traded a broke plow blade for Mr. Harlan's whole milk cow." Esther looked at the boy. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, very slight, before she put it back where it belonged. "Is that so?" she said. "Then I suppose we shall see." She rose from the table and began opening the kitchen cupboards one by one, making a quiet inventory of what was there. Thomas watched her do it with his chin nearly resting on the tabletop. "We're out of molasses," he told her helpfully. "I know," she said, without turning. "I can see that." Thomas leaned closer. "And the flour's got a bug in it." "Weevils," Esther said. "You can sift them out. Go wash your hands before supper." Thomas went, obediently enough, which surprised Silas because the boy did not always go so readily for him. He stood in the kitchen a moment longer, watching Esther move through the space with that quiet, assessing efficiency, and he thought, "She knows what she's doing." Whatever else she was, she knew what she was doing. Supper that night was salt pork and potatoes and a cornbread that Esther produced from apparently nothing, and it was better than anything Silas had made in 8 months. Thomas ate 2 plates and didn't speak much, which for him meant he was entirely content. When Esther cleared the table, she stacked the dishes without ceremony and then paused, looking at the single chair beside the stove where Silas usually sat in the evenings. She said nothing about it, but Silas noticed her notice it. The first week was a careful negotiation of space. Esther woke before anyone and had the stove going by the time Silas came down, not from eagerness but from efficiency. She'd explained, without being asked, that she slept poorly past 5 in the morning and that she preferred to be useful rather than lie awake. Silas accepted this without comment. He learned quickly what to say and what to leave alone. She didn't want help in the kitchen. She didn't want opinions about how she arranged the pantry shelves. She did, he discovered, want honesty. If something was broken or needed, she wanted to know plainly, not worked around. In return, she was honest about what she found. The woodpile needed splitting and stacking before hard winter came. The water barrel had a seam going soft on the south side. The kitchen window had a gap in the caulking that was letting the cold in past the frame. She wrote these things in a small notebook in her neat, controlled hand, and she gave the list to Silas on the 3rd morning with the same manner you'd hand someone a bill. He took it. He fixed them, one by one, in the order she'd written them. Thomas trailed after Esther through most of those first days, with the magnetic attention small boys give to new and interesting things. She didn't encourage it and she didn't discourage it. She answered his questions directly and asked him questions back, the kind that required him to think. "What do you know?" was the first thing she said to him one morning when he appeared at her elbow while she was mending a shirt. He'd blinked and said he knew lots of things. "Name 3, she'd said, still sewing. He'd counted on his fingers. He knew how to catch a horned toad. He knew the name of every horse in their small remuda, and he knew the first verse of the 23rd Psalm, because his mama had taught him before she died. Esther's needle stopped, just for a moment. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, her face was composed and neutral, and she said, "That's a good verse to know. Can you say it?" He said it. He said it the way children say things they have truly memorized and loved, not in a hurry, but with care for each word. And when he finished, Esther looked at him for a moment that stretched a beat longer than usual. "Your mother taught you well," she said. Her voice was level and even, but she set the mending down and went to stand at the window for a minute before she picked it back up, and Silas, who was coming in from the barn and caught the tail end of it from the doorway, did not say a word about what he had seen on her face. Midway through October, the weather went from sharp to mean. The wind came out of the northwest and didn't let up, and the temperature dropped far enough that the water in the wash basin was skimmed with ice each morning. Silas drove to Clearwater Flats for supplies and came back with news along with the flour and the salt. There was a land agent from Cheyenne named Hartwell making rounds through the county, talking to ranchers about a grazing consolidation, which was a polite term, as Silas explained to Esther that evening, for a larger outfit buying up water rights until the small operators had no choice but to sell or dry out. 3 families in the South Valley had already signed papers. Esther listened to this with her hands around her coffee cup, looking at the table. She said, "Do you have water rights documented?" He said he had the original deed from when his wife's father had filed the claim. She said, "Let me see it." He brought the deed box from the bedroom and she read through the papers at the table under the lamp, slowly and with the concentration she gave everything. And when she was done, she said, "This is thin. A good lawyer could argue around the water language." He said he knew. She said, "Is there anyone in town who could advise you?" He said there was a man named Aldridge who'd read law before he came west, worked now at the Courier. She said, "Go see him." It wasn't a suggestion, quite. He looked at her. "You sound like you've dealt with this before." A pause settled over the table. Thomas had gone to bed an hour ago and the house was quiet, except for the wind doing its work on the eaves. Esther set the papers down, squaring their edges against the table. She said, "My father's estate, after he died. Men with papers and good suits and excellent manners can take everything a family owns, and they do it with a handshake and a smile." She said it flatly, like a fact about weather. But Silas heard what was beneath it, and he thought he understood, suddenly, a little more of what had brought a woman like her to a place like this on the terms she'd specified. No attachment, no family, a clean exit when things changed. He didn't press. He said he'd see Aldridge in the morning. She nodded and gathered the papers back into the box and set it beside him on the table. "Keep this somewhere dry," she said, "and somewhere you can put your hands on it fast if you need to." He took the box. Their hands didn't quite touch in the exchange, but came close enough that he was aware of the distance, precisely. He went to bed thinking about water rights, and found himself thinking about something else entirely before he slept. The Hartwell problem came to a head on a Thursday near the end of October, and it came in a form Silas hadn't expected, not a threat but an offer, delivered in person. Hartwell was younger than Silas had pictured, well-dressed, with the smooth confidence of a man who'd found that being pleasant cost nothing and opened most doors. He rode up to the ranch in mid-morning, with 2 men behind him, and asked if he could speak with Silas about a business matter. Silas said he could speak. He did not invite him inside. Esther was in the house with Thomas doing their daily lessons at the kitchen table, and Silas stood on the porch in his work clothes and listened to Hartwell lay out an offer for the water rights and the west pasture. Generous, he said, more than fair. Silas said he wasn't selling. Hartwell nodded like a man who'd expected that and tried a different angle. The offer would not stay on the table, he said. Come spring, when the bigger operators had the valley's water tied up, small outfits like this one would find grazing difficult, might even find the creek running less than full. Silas looked at him. He said, "Are you telling me somebody plans to interfere with a waterway on my land?" Hartwell smiled and said he was speaking in generalities. He said Silas should think about his boy, about what kind of future a small ranch in a county going consolidated could really offer. Silas's jaw tightened. He was about to answer when the front door opened and Esther came out onto the porch. She was carrying a cup of coffee for herself, apparently, and she stopped as if surprised to see visitors, which Silas was fairly certain she wasn't. She looked at Hartwell with those level gray-green eyes. Hartwell looked at her with the reflexive appraisal men give women, and then a different kind of attention when something didn't fit his expectation. Esther said pleasantly, "I couldn't help hearing, you're discussing the water rights." Hartwell said that was correct, a private matter between himself and Mr. Cade. Esther said, "Of course." She looked at the deed box she was holding in her other hand. Silas saw she'd brought it with her from the house, and she said, "I was just showing my husband the language in the original filing. The water claim is listed under Wyoming Territorial Statute 1874, Article 7, which requires any third-party claim on a documented agricultural water right to be adjudicated by a district judge, not negotiated by a land agent." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. Hartwell's smile stayed on his face the way paint stays on wood in rain, present but not convincing. He said he wasn't aware she was a legal authority. Esther said she wasn't one. She said her father had simply taught her to read carefully, and that she'd found the statute in a copy of territorial law at the Clearwater Public Library. She said it pleasantly, conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather. Hartwell looked from her to Silas. Silas looked back at him without expression. Hartwell said he'd let his principals know about the family's position. He tipped his hat and rode away with his men, and when the sound of the horses was gone, Esther set the deed box down on the porch railing and drank her coffee. Silas said, "You went to the library." She said, "Tuesday morning, while you took Thomas to school." He said, "You didn't mention it." She said, "I wasn't certain it would be necessary." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You called yourself my wife." A pause. The wind moved through the sage. She said, "I said husband, because it carries more legal weight in a conversation like that. I needed him uncertain." She looked out at the road. "I hope that wasn't overstepping." He thought about his son's future. He thought about the water. He thought about the way she'd walked out that door carrying exactly what she needed. He said, "No, it wasn't." November came in gently, as if apologizing for October, and the brief softening of the weather felt like a held breath before whatever winter intended. In that quiet interlude, something changed at the Cade Ranch, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that change tends to happen in real life, through small actions that accumulate until the shape of things is different, and you can't quite say when the difference began. Silas built a second chair. He didn't say anything about it. He worked on it in the evenings in the barn after Thomas was asleep, using cedar wood he'd saved from a fence repair, and he brought it in on a Wednesday and set it beside the first chair by the stove. Esther saw it and was quiet for a moment. She said, "You didn't need to do that." He said the floor was cold and a person shouldn't have to stand in the evenings. She sat in it that night and the next night and every night after, and the two chairs by the stove became a kind of nightly ritual, the house going quiet around them, Thomas asleep, the fire burning down, the two of them reading or simply sitting while the wind did its work outside. They talked, sometimes. Not about important things at first, gradually about more. She told him, one evening, that she had come from a family of some means in Ohio, and that the means had evaporated along with her father's estate, and that she had a pride that made it very difficult to stay somewhere she could not contribute in full measure. He understood that kind of pride without needing it explained. Thomas, for his part, was blooming in the way children do when they have consistent structure and honest attention. His letters were improving. Esther drilled him without mercy on his numbers, but when he got something right, she said so plainly and without excessive praise, which somehow meant more to him than enthusiasm would have. One morning he read aloud a full paragraph from a primer, and when he finished, he looked at Esther with enormous eyes and said, "Did I do it?" She said, "You did." He threw himself at her in a 6-year-old's impulsive hug, and she caught him, briefly, with both arms, and her face over his head was very careful and very still, holding something complicated. She let him go after a moment and redirected him firmly back to the page. But Silas had seen. He was beginning to understand that Esther Vance's self-possession was not coldness. It was a wall built for specific reasons, and the boy was getting through it the way only children can, not by understanding the wall, but by simply not acknowledging it was there. One Sunday in late November, which was Esther's day and therefore hers alone, she came back from wherever she went on those mornings. Silas never asked, to find Silas and Thomas waiting on the porch with their hats in their hands, and Thomas holding, at arm's length with great ceremony, a small cluster of dried winter berries tied with a piece of blue ribbon. There was no occasion. Thomas had found the berries in the fence line, and Silas had found the ribbon in a tin on the shelf, left from some previous winter he didn't think about directly. Thomas thrust them out and said, "These are for you. Papa said I could pick them." Esther looked at the berries. She looked at Thomas's earnest, upturned face. She looked briefly at Silas, who was looking at his hat. She took the berries. She said, "Thank you, Thomas. They're lovely." Thomas beamed. He said, "Papa said you might like something from the land, since you can't go far on account of your shoes aren't right for the rocky parts." Silas closed his eyes briefly. Esther's mouth moved. This time she let it. She looked at Silas with something in her expression that he hadn't seen there before, something gentle and unguarded, and she said, "That was considerate." He said, "The boy thought of it." She said, And she went inside, and through the kitchen window Silas saw her set the berries in a cup of water on the windowsill, where they stayed for the rest of the season. That evening she asked him, without preamble, what his wife had been like. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said she had been good. She had been patient, and she had loved Thomas with everything she had, and she had died of a fever 2 winters past, and the world had been less warm since. He said it plainly, because Esther had taught him, without trying to, that plain was better. She listened, she said. She taught him the 23rd Psalm. He said yes. But Esther was quiet. Then she said, "When Thomas said that verse to me, that first week, I had a son." She said it, and then she was still, looking at the fire. He was 4. There was a fever that winter. Silas did not move. The fire said what words couldn't. After a time he said, "I'm sorry, Esther." She nodded, just once. And she did not cry, not then, but she pressed her lips together and looked at the flames for a long time, and Silas stayed in his chair beside her and did not go anywhere. The agreement between them, he was beginning to think, had a clause that neither of them had written down, a clause that said, "You are not alone in this house." Not anymore. In the spring, when the creek ran full and the land was green, and the Hartwell Company had turned its attention to easier ground after finding the Cade water rights rather more documented than expected, Silas Cade asked Esther Vance if she would be willing to renegotiate the terms of their arrangement. She looked at him across the breakfast table while Thomas ate his oatmeal and didn't bother pretending not to listen. She said, "What terms did you have in mind?" He said, "Permanent ones." Thomas said loudly, "That means stay forever." Silas said, Thomas. Thomas said, "That's what it means," and applied himself back to his oatmeal with serene confidence. Esther looked at Silas. Something in her face was open in the way it had not been when she stepped off that train in October. She said, "I would require the east window room to remain mine for reading." He said that was agreeable. She said, "And I would like a proper shelf for the kitchen. Not a board on pegs, a real shelf, fitted to the wall." He said he could build that. She looked at him for a moment more. She said, "Then I believe we can discuss permanent terms." Thomas cheered. The oatmeal suffered for it. Esther reached over without looking and steadied his bowl, and Silas saw it. That simple, automatic gesture of a woman who had let herself belong somewhere again. And he thought that a home is not a building. It is the particular and irreplaceable arrangement of people who have chosen to stay. There is something this story would like to leave with you, friend, as you settle in for the evening. It is simply this: the agreements we make in desperation sometimes become the truest things in our lives. Silas Cade needed someone capable. Esther Vance needed somewhere safe. Thomas needed, as all children do, to be seen and to see in return. None of them asked for love. But love, being practical and patient, found its way in through the cold gaps in the walls, through the mending and the meals and the second chair by the stove, through a small boy reciting scripture until a careful woman remembered how to feel the words. What brought you to a place of beginning again? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. If these frontier stories speak to your heart, subscribe and come back. There are more journeys waiting by the fire. Good night. God bless you and yours, now and always.